So in our previous episode, we chatted to Stu, who's the museum creator here, about how the aircraft came to be at the Wings Over the Rockies Museum, and I might drop a little clip of that in here. I guess the question is, how the heck did you get one of the only two B-1As that survived the test program?
Well, again, this one was brought here as a ground trainer. So technically, by Air Force parlance, it's a GB-1A, because it's a ground instructional airframe. But it was brought in here to, as you say, with Lowry's mission of being a training base for armaments handling. It was brought in here to help crews learn to load the ALCM, the air-launched cruise missiles, and also as well as the iron bombs and any nuclear weapons. They were all trained on this particular airframe because it was a spare at that point. The A model having been discontinued after just the four were built, and Bombay and so on was essentially the same as the B model, so that they used this as a trainer. And then when the museum or when the Air Force closed the base, they really didn't want the cost of cutting this up or towing this out of here, so it was transferred over to the Air Force Museum in Dayton for their ownership-wise, and left here and put on loan to the new Wings Over the Rockies Museum.
So possession 9/10 of the law.
Something like that, yeah.
But because we have access to a B-1A, it's going to be fun to talk about some of the subtle differences between this aircraft and the operational B-1B, because there are quite a few noticeable elements that are different on the two types, isn't there, Joe?
That's right. The mission of the two aircraft between the A and the B changed in its whole life cycle, and you can go back to that first episode.
Yeah, we'll put it in here.
Or wherever that goes. Yeah, to really get that story. He knows that way better than I do. But originally, the summary of it is, originally this was designed as a fast supersonic bomber, Mach 2 plus, I forget how fast, but at least Mach 2.
I think it was, yeah.
I think so, yeah. And kind of a multi-mission. It had that mission, but also could do low altitude supersonic penetration as well.
Which, interestingly, is a similar role to our other favorite aircraft here on the Damcast, which is the B-58. So the US Air Force get rid of one, and then they do this.
Yeah, exactly. Initially, this was not really designed for stealth. I mean, it was sort of, and some of the blending and some of the shaping was certainly lower observable than like a B-52, but its stealth aspects, I mean, it was in the infancy of stealth, so there wasn't as much done. The reincarnation of this, so of course that B-1A got canceled in the late 70s, I think. Reagan, when he got...
Carter administration.
Yeah, Carter administration. When Reagan got elected, I think it was one of his campaign promises to California of vote for me and I'll bring this back. And of course it was going to be built in California and bring a lot of jobs and so forth.
Yeah.
So that happened. I'm sure there's more to that story than that as well, but that's the summary I've heard.
And dear ladies and gentlemen, we are biased here because we are both wearing this logo, of course, of North American Aviation, which became Rockwell. So we're quite happy to be doing this.
Exactly. So the new mission of the aircraft, first of all, I think the reason it got canceled was the Air Force knew the stealth bomber was coming. Of course, that wasn't public knowledge at the time, so nobody understood why this aircraft was canceled, but that was a big part of it, allegedly. So the new mission of this was slow it down. It's still supersonic, but it didn't need to go Mach 2 anymore. Focus it more on the low-level mission and make it more stealthy. And so the primary change that I'm aware of to make it more stealthy are the engine inlets. So the original inlets to go Mach 2 has to have a variable ramped inlet, much like on the F-14 or Concorde for that matter, or the XB-70 Valkyrie, where you've got to turn that air, you've got to have variable geometry to better balance it at high supersonic speed versus lower speeds, subsonic speeds, and so forth. So the original inlets, which are kind of on this aircraft, look much like that. If you look at a Valkyrie inlet, it actually looks very much like this. Valkyrie has 6 engines, of course, fed by essentially 2 inlets back to back. This has 2 inlets back to back on each side that each feed a single engine. So once you get to the back, it's not the same, but the vertical 2D variable geometry inlet is very much like the Valkyrie, or like I said, like the F-14 just turned 90 degrees, or like Concorde turned 90 degrees. The B-1B, because it no longer needs to go Mach 2.2, they could simplify the inlet. So all those moving parts, the ramps and so forth, went away. They also did another trick on the B-1B, which radar going into an inlet and reflecting off the front fan or the face of the engine is apparently one of the most reflective, radar speaking, parts of an entire airplane. So the B-1B, apparently if you stand at the front of it, you cannot see the engine, even though you should be able to. And it's because they've got this serpentine path of basically vanes that weave the air back and forth through the inlet to get to the face of the engine. But because that radar can't like directly go shine off of that face and get back out. So that's probably one of the bigger changes of the airplane.
Of course, the other one is the cockpit.
The cockpit, yes.
Which
so
they've nicely marked out for us here.
Yep. So the original B-1A, to eject from this, had a whole capsule that came out. And it's funny, so the F-111 right behind it here is a similar design. So there's no specific ejection seats in this aircraft. If you want to eject from the F-111, that whole cockpit section, you can kind of see the lines of it right here and coming back, and it goes up, and that black leading edge is actually part of that as well. So that whole thing ejects if you eject in a 111. And then there's a parachute that comes out of the back. That black strake there is actually important. We'll come back to the B-1 on that in a second, because when they eject at supersonic speed, that actually stabilizes that capsule and keeps it pointing forward. Another one that I read on this at one point, apparently this is the only aircraft in the world that you can eject from underwater. So the Rockies in this, I don't know how deep this works, but apparently if you land this thing in the water and you didn't yet eject and you're underwater, you can eject and it'll get out of the water and high enough for the parachutes to open and survive it. So a little fun fact on that. So on the B-1, similar, is much larger because you have more crew, but that yellow tape line, that is a whole capsule that comes out. And then if you look toward the back, you can see something that looks kind of like a flying surface, and it is. So that's contoured to the aircraft. When this thing ejects, those fold out, and they do the same thing as those strakes on the F-111. So those are basically little stabilization fins that keep the cockpit pointing forward as you eject that. And for whatever reason, I think they had some issues on this. I know there was one B-1A that crashed due to a fuel transfer problem. I don't think any of that crew escaped, and I think I don't remember the details of this, but I think the escape capsule is partially at fault there. I don't know if that's what led it to go away on the B-1B, but the B-1B has essentially standard ejection seats that eject up, and each position has their own.
Yeah, because supersonic ejection's always been an issue, because if we actually come just around here, we have the quite terrifying B-58 ejection capsule.
Yep.
Which, when it sort of, this element is the clamshell snaps down, and of course, as Sonny Holt told us in our previous episode, it was a shirt sleeve aircraft because this pressurizes, keeps you safe, and you don't need all the fancy stuff that you would do in a normal fighter bomber type aircraft, of course. Look at it. Oh, sorry.
Oh, I wish we had one of these here.
Oh. Yes, we'll, there's more on that. As we always do on this show, we take every opportunity to talk about the B-58. But if we head this way, we can start getting in. So there's the Struden. I'm not even sure what that is. We'll have to come back and have a look at that. But
actually, here's a good view as well. Should have pointed this out when we were over there. So there's a little rotating fin thing right behind that white line. You can kind of see it there. That survived onto the B-1B as well.
So that's trim, isn't it?
Well, sort of. It's what it is. It's a damper, and so when this thing is flying at low level on its low ground following supersonic mission, you hit gusts really bad at low level. It's rising air currents coming off of trees and roads and rivers and so forth. So this aircraft is large enough. All aircraft are flexible. The aircraft is, you think of it as this rigid, solid thing, but they all bend. And the bigger the airplane, the more they bend. And you can see this, like if you're on an airliner and you fly through turbulence, you see the wings flex up and down. Fuselages do the same thing. And when you get an aircraft this long, it's really hard to get it so stiff that doesn't show up. And on an aircraft like this that's flying supersonic at 200 feet above the ground and hitting turbulence, this thing is just getting bounced all over the place. And because of the length of this and where the cockpit's at, the ride quality for the pilots was really objectionable. They were shaking so much due to this resonance of the fuselage, they almost couldn't fly the aircraft. So these were put on, and so there's a feedback control loop and a gyro in the aircraft that these sit there and pivot and basically damp out that vibration. So the whole aircraft is still bouncing around and flexing, but these move in such a way that, kind of like a hawk, when they hold their head steady when they're focused on and buffeting around. It's exactly what these do, is they keep the cockpit steady, so the ride quality for pilots was much lower. Another neat thing about this airplane that actually made it feasible to change its mission was you didn't need this much wing sweep once you're only going Mach 1.25. You could get away with the swing wing, and you could sweep the wing out, and that would be just fine. However, the really swept wing actually made the ride quality at supersonic speeds at low altitude way better. And the reason is, when you have a wing that is this long and slanted back, when you hit a gust, your whole aircraft doesn't hit the gust at the same time. It hits the front of the wing here, and then it takes milliseconds, but more time for that gust velocity to progress back along the wing. So the whole impact on the airplane is much reduced when you have a very swept wing airplane like this. And so I think it was also, they really just wanted to bring this airplane back without redesigning it, but it was a good kind of a combination of circumstances of, it's not a terrible design for that one specific mission, even though just for a speed alone, you don't need this much sweep.
Because that is an incredibly long wing.
It's a very long wing.
Yeah, dear viewer, we're about not even halfway down down this aircraft when we've reached the inlets.
Yeah, it's the span when this thing has its wings out is like an airliner. I mean, I don't know what the wingspan is, 180 feet or something like that.
We'll stick it in as a thing on the bottom. That's it.
We were talking in the last episode about the MiG-23 and that pivoting wing and the challenges of that. This one is no different. I've seen pictures. I can send you one to put in the video. So this one works in the same way. There's one pin right about there somewhere that this wing pivots around. The pin on this thing, I can't remember. It's something like 18 inches in diameter, and it's about as tall as I am. Like I've got a picture of this thing being manufactured with the engineers or the maintenance techs dropping this pin into its place, and the pin is the size of me. Like, it's massive. But you can imagine all of that load of that wing, which again is like an airliner wing, going through one pin. It's a really big pin. I have no idea what that weighs. Tens of thousands of pounds.
And incredible tolerances for it must have been tiny.
They have to be, because you can't have any what's called free play or movement in that. And so the way something like that is put together, they freeze the pin so it shrinks, they heat up the receptacle for it, the bushing that it goes into, and all that has to be extremely precise, and then it drops in place, and then as soon as it equalizes in temperature, the pin expands, the bushing shrink down, and it's tight. And so it's called an interference fit at that point. There's no free play for the wings to wiggle.
So we're down here, and I think, funnily enough, as we've come to this side, I think the other side is a better view for the intake, isn't it?
Yeah, they're about the same, but we can see it either way.
Let's wander around here.
Yeah, and I love this airplane being painted this color, because it's what they all were, other than the original test birds were white, of course. But it's hard to see things, though. This airplane is so dark. It just looks so Cold War.
Let's sneak over here.
Yeah, there's better light over here.
It's coming over on this side a bit better.
Yeah, so
we can see the seams.
Not a lot to see here. This aircraft no longer has its engines. They've been blocked off. You can't really see inside, but you can see the hinge here for this ramp as it moves in and out. This is all filled with holes, if you can see that on the camera. So that's that boundary layer bleed. There is some variable geometry here. These come open at lower speed to get more airflow into the engine. You can see some outlets here. I think that's where that bleed air that goes in through those holes comes down, forward and gets exited out through these.
So really what we're doing here is much like on, as you said, on Concorde and things like that.
Yeah.
You're creating that shock wave to allow air to slow down enough so that they can be turned back into thrust going out the other side.
Yeah, so a shockwave, so this is a ramp here. It's hard to see because it's really thin. You can see this is kind of like the leading edge on an F-104, super sharp. I mean, like really sharp. So there's a ramp here, so a shock wave, the air comes and hits this splitter, half of it goes that way, half of it goes that way. Because there's a ramp, shock wave comes out here. In supersonic flight, this door will be closed. There's a little bit of a notch here. So this geometry is designed at the speed this thing would have been going at, whatever, I'm not sure what Mach number it would have been optimized for, but high ones, low twos probably. That shock wave is coming back to here. This notch is here to let some of that shock wave basically spill out without interfering with this edge. And then I actually don't know what it looks like beyond here. There's probably a second ramp angle inside of there. Actually, you can kind of see there's a hinge here, so this would move at some point at higher speed. So then a second shock wave would come out here as a second region that the airflow flows through and slows down. And then at some point when you get back here, there'll be what's called a normal shock, which is when it actually slows down to subsonic flow, and then it transitions back to the engine, and the face of the engine is probably in here somewhere. It takes some amount of time or space, distance, for all that to happen, and for the airflow to kind of realign itself and get happy, essentially. So then, yeah, this is all engine.
Just before we head back down here, these are essentially mini Valkyrie inlets, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. So the Valkyrie, I'm sure there's differences, and the inlet experts out there will
because they
probably say much different, but essentially this is what the Valkyrie inlet looks like. One of them, well, one set of these, a left and a right, on the center line of the aircraft, and then this goes back to one engine on the Valkyrie. It then expands further back and hits 3 engines on each side for a total of 6, if I remember right.
Because it's more or less the same design team.
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I don't know that for sure, but I would guess so.
Well,
same company.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would guess it was a lot of the same people.
So right, there we go. We can keep going backwards now. Or
this
aft, sorry.
This is the cruise missile that Stu was talking about earlier. So these things are massive, right? Like, and these have a jet engine in the back. There's wings here. I think this is just a training one, so this is all stuck, but there's wings that pop out here. And then up in the bomb bay, which we can go look at in a second. So I think 6 of these would be on a rotating carrier, and then they would, like he was talking about, it would rotate and drop these out one at a time.
Oh, let's see if I can. There we go, there's the latches for them. Massive, heavy bits of metal. As we get to the end, we'll see this is AGM 86. There we go. So we can put that in.
Again, engines aren't in here, but I think the afterburner nozzle would come back out here, and probably the engine would end somewhere in here. I think we were talking about vortex generators earlier. I don't know if these ended up on the final, the B-1B. I suspect they did. Because this was a flight test article, it's possible those were there just on these aircraft as well, I'm not sure. But so as an aircraft like this, especially when it's this long, gets, tapering back, the airflow builds up on the aircraft and sticks to the skin a little bit. It's what's called boundary layer. On an aircraft this long, the boundary layer back here is probably 8 or 10 inches thick, like it's big. And boundary layer has low energy, so it doesn't like to follow contours. It likes to separate, and when it separates, it causes a lot of drag. So those vortex generators re-energize that slowed down air, get it basically sticky again, so it stays onto that contour and greatly reduces the drag.
So I think when we talk about that, we've been talking on the Century ones before as well about Coke bottles and things like that, because you can see that very profoundly on this airframe, and we can get upstairs and have a look down on the top.
Yeah,
we can see that.
Every surface, there's no flat surface on this airplane. It is all contoured, no flat or cylindrical. It's all contoured to be exactly the shape they want it to be. This has an all-flying tail, which means it doesn't have a separate elevator. That entire tail pivots, based on, you can kind of see the pivot point right there in the middle. It's not an absolute requirement, but nearly all supersonic aircraft have that, because traditional fixed tails with elevators are not very effective once you go supersonic. And the reason is the way an elevator on an aircraft works, it's usually the last 20 or 30% of the chord. The way an elevator works is it deflects the airflow but then that deflection actually has the ability to affect the airflow over the entire tail. So you can just deflect it at the back, but the whole tail is producing more downforce or up force. Once you're supersonic, all of the airflow is moving so fast that whatever's happening to the back of the tail, the front of the tail doesn't know that. Not that it's intelligent, but there's no way for those pressure waves to get back up front. So when you have an elevator on just the back part of your tail, you don't get that effect anymore once you're going supersonic of the entire tail being effective. So almost all supersonic aircraft have what's called an all-flying tail, where you pivot the entire tail to get it to work, because then the very leading edge is doing something when you need to control the aircraft. I suspect this is the largest flying tail ever built. I don't know, so there's some big Russian supersonic airplanes. They might have a speed on that, but it's big. I mean, that's like the size of probably an F-100 wing, if I had to guess.
Right, let's pop upstairs.
Yeah.
So we've come upstairs as we were chatting with Stu, and frankly, this view is naughty, isn't it? Because it's just gorgeous. And yes, let's be fair, this is a weapon of war designed to deliver nuclear weapons, but the team at North American certainly made it look pretty. But the prettiness all has purpose, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So this is a really good example of area ruling. You can see the cockpit, is large. A, for space for the crew, but also because it's at that nose area where there's no wing, there's no inlets, there's nothing else going on. So you want that cross-sectional area of the airplane to be building up kind of very nice and gradually as you come back. Then as soon as you get behind the cockpit, kind of where those panels are missing on the upper surface, the wing starts to come in. You can see the very leading edge of the wing up there. So your cross-sectional area is building again. So that's right when you want to start to ease that transition. So you take the fuselage and you start to neck it back down. So you can really see that pronounced on this aircraft. Then you come back, as you get back kind of to the root trailing edge of the wing, you still have wing back here, but it's getting smaller and smaller as you go. And so then you actually want to start building that cross-section back up a little to kind of blend into the tail area. And then when the tail comes in, that's when the back end really starts to neck down again. So if you take all those pieces as a whole and draw a plot or a chart of the cross-sectional area from the nose to the tail, you get this really nice, gentle, sloping curve, as opposed to having big, sharp changes like when the wing or the tail comes in. And that's really one of the secrets for low supersonic drag. Because when this air is coming over the airplane, it has to move out of the way. And if it has to move in all directions at the same time, that's what causes really big shock waves and really big drag. If it can be moving in one area and kind of filling in another area, that's kind of a really simplified way of saying it, you get less overall drag. And so that's really all that area ruling is about.
So it's just keeping the air as smooth as possible, not scaring it out of the way, and just then getting it to exit when we get to here, which is why we've got the cone, tail cone on it as well.
Yeah.
Just to make that journey from, because air is a fluid, isn't it? So it wants to find its shortest route between A to B.
Yeah.
So pointy end to pointy end.
Yep.
But then at the same time, clever designers will try to do as much with that airflow as they can as it moves forward.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, it moves aft even. But I guess from up here as well, we can just see how massive that wing is.
Yeah, it's so big.
Yeah. And just the packaging on the top of the engine nacelle as well is interesting, that it does actually have a sharp edge there, which I think is blended out on the B.
I feel like that's true as well. Yeah, that something doesn't look right there. Yeah. Notice also is we've got these ailerons on the wing that when the wing is unswept work. You can obviously, they don't work in this position. They're on top of the engine nacelle, so they're not doing anything. It's possible the last one might work, but I don't think so. I think all of the roll control of this aircraft, if I remember right, once it was supersonic with the wings folded back, was through the flying tail. So it was kind of like an F-16 or a modern fighter, where it not only is providing pitch control, but it can operate differentially and provide roll control as well.
It is a real treat seeing this aircraft. And I guess what we'll do is, as we go through this, I'll drop in some pictures as well for the variations on the B.
Yeah.
Mainly because that means I get to put some noisy clips of an incredibly noisy B-1B flying past.
I've got a story on that. So I went to school in Wichita, Kansas, and there was still is an Air Force base there called McConnell Air Force Base. When I was going to school, it was an active B-1B base. I happened to, by choice, live in a rental house that was right off the runway of McConnell. And it didn't happen very often, but about once a month, they would do B-1 scrambles, where I think they had a dozen aircraft there, and they would take off in full afterburner right over my house. And it was the most amazing thing ever. They would often do it at night, and when it was at night, you would hear them coming, you would run outside, because there would be 12 of them taking off in a line. And it would light up the sky. The brightness of those afterburners, and over my house, they were probably at least 1,000 feet up, maybe 2. They were still so loud you couldn't have a conversation. They were just deafening. But the light that those afterburners put out was just amazing. And so never will forget that.
So the realtor loved you when they found an aviation buff.
Oh yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay, let's get down and look at the bomb bays. So we are, I guess, 3/4 of the way down the aircraft here. So here's the tail cone up there. And of course, Joe is still with us because we have 3 bomb bays going forward here. Now this one here has had the fixings for the rotary one taken out. We'll see that as we go forward. But just to show you how long these bomb bays are.
Yeah, you could basically put a car in here.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's massive. Well, the cruise missile we were just seeing, like I said, I think 6 of these would fit in each of these bays, and there's 3 of them. So yeah, they're quite large.
Let's jump the rope because we can. And if we lost a decent picture there, dear viewer, that's because I was trying very hard not to fall flat on my ass as I went over that. But so here we have Type 3A test specimen object sphere that they have, about 6 feet long, and you've got plenty of room either side. So if we look up here, we can see rear attachments for the rotary fitting on there. And if we start walking forward, they have a few of the shapes here. We can see we're in midsection for the gear bays are, and as you can see, these are hefty
through over here.
Hefty things. We can go the other side. There's a little bit more room. Come forward, and it's a long walk front to back and back to front. So we're getting our steps in today, and then you have screen showing things. That was not an original piece of equipment on the B-1, but again, 3 bays. Same size. Actually, these ones might be a bit longer, mightn't they?
I think they might be.
Yeah. So big flat doors. There's the motor for the rotary side, and then the forward bay here. It is a massive aircraft, and you think all of it designed for performance, for speed, for carrying a quite hefty payload, and all at twice the speed of sound, which is nuts.
It's nuts.
So there we go. Let's just wander around the front, and we'll wrap this up because my battery's about to die.
Yeah, there's actually an interesting feature. If I remember the details correctly, one of the missions of this aircraft was to be on essentially a dirt strip somewhere in what the eastern side of Western Europe, probably Germany, on alert, and have the crew in a bunker somewhere, and these APU start, alerts start. It's about all the more I know about it, but apparently the crew on this aircraft could run out to the aircraft, get this aircraft started, climb up inside, and take off with essentially no ground support, which was a very non-common thing, especially for an aircraft of this size. Of course, maintenance people were still very important. It's not like there's no maintenance to be done and had to be staged in that condition. But the fact that this thing just sitting idle, you can come up, press a couple buttons. By the time you got up there, the APU started, and you can scramble this thing. An airplane this big with no ground crew, or virtually no ground crew, is just mind-boggling.
Well, thanks for that, Joe. And thank you very much to Stu and the team here at Wings Over the Rockies for letting us play with some of their airplanes. And yeah, that is just really another very beautiful aircraft by North American Aviation. There we go. Let's zoom in on that as the final. There we go. I just want to say many thanks to our fabulous Damcasteers on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the crew and get your name in the credits from just £3 a month plus a bit of ad. The Damcasters is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad podcast production.